My name is Sarah Wright, and I was 27 years old when my relationship ended in front of 53 people who weren't supposed to be part of it. Up until that Thursday night, my life felt stable. Not perfect, not cinematic, just solid. I had a decent job, an apartment that finally felt like home, and a boyfriend I'd been with for a little over 14 months. We met at a college alumni event, one of those awkward mixers where everyone pretends they're not networking while absolutely networking. He was charming in a low-effort way, funny without trying too hard, the kind of man people immediately felt comfortable around. I thought that meant something. Our social world revolved around one massive group chat that had existed since freshman year. What started as 12 people cramming for exams had grown into a sprawling digital neighborhood. Friends, partners, coworkers, spouses. 50-plus people sharing memes, birthdays, breakups, engagements. It was loud, messy, and constant. And until that night, it felt safe. That evening was painfully ordinary. Leftover pizza, sweatpants, phone in one hand, scrolling through plans for a mutual friend's upcoming birthday barbecue. I remember thinking about whether I should bring pasta salad or just wine. Then his name appeared at the top of the chat. A voice note. That alone made me pause. He hated voice notes, said they felt performative. I assumed it was an accident, maybe meant for someone else. I pressed play. The first thing I heard was laughter. His laughter. Loose. Intimate. Then his voice settled into something unmistakably cruel. God, she's so clueless. I literally just got back from seeing you, and she didn't even ask where I was. I'm not leaving my ex-girlfriend. Just deal with it. She's comfortable. She pays for things. You're different. I can have both. She'll never find out. She trusts me completely, which is honestly kind of pathetic. Anyway, I'll call you later when she falls asleep. Love you. 23 seconds. That's how long it took for 14 months of trust to collapse. For about 30 seconds afterward, the group chat was silent. No typing bubbles, no reactions. Just the glowing evidence sitting there replayable. My brain refused to cooperate. I replayed it once, then again. Then again, like repetition might turn it into something else. A joke, a misunderstanding, anything but what it was. Then the messages started. Sarah, are you seeing this? Is this real? Call me right now. Holy shit. My best friend messaged privately, don't respond yet, breathe. But I didn't need to breathe. Somewhere between the first and 20th replay, something inside me went very still. The late nights, the phone face down, the distance blamed on stress. It all aligned with terrifying precision. I typed one sentence into the group chat. Consider it dealt with. Then I opened my social media and changed my relationship status from in a relationship to single. The notification hit instantly. Screenshots followed. My phone started ringing. His name lit up my screen. I declined. Again. Then the texts flooded in panic. Apologies. Explanations that hadn't existed 30 minutes earlier. I muted the conversation. The group chat exploded. Reactions. Transcriptions. Someone highlighted the word pathetic with a clown emoji. His closest friend tried to intervene, calling it a misunderstanding. No one bought it. Around midnight, my doorbell rang. I checked the camera. His face was streaked with desperation mascara smudged from someone else's tears he'd borrowed. Sarah, please, let me explain. I spoke through the intercom. You said you're not leaving your ex-girlfriend, so go be with her. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. Good night. I turned it off. He stayed there for 20 minutes before someone came to get him. I slept deeply that night. The next morning, I woke up to 200 messages and a story that was only just beginning. I woke up Friday morning to my phone vibrating like it was having a seizure. 212 notifications. For a few seconds, I didn't remember why. That strange, blissful gap between sleep and reality held on just long enough for me to feel normal. Then it all came rushing back, the voice note, his laugh, the word pathetic echoing in my head like it had been carved there. This was the moment the emotions finally caught up. Anger hit first. Sharp, hot, almost physical. Then humiliation, the kind that crawls up your spine when you realize dozens of people heard the most private betrayal of your life in real time. I stood under the shower until the water went cold, replaying everything I'd missed because I trusted the wrong man. When I finally shut it off, my hands were shaking. He still had things at my apartment. Not much. He never officially moved in, but there were clothes in my closet toiletries in the bathroom. A phone charger tangled behind my nightstand, a couple of books he'd sworn he'd return someday. I grabbed a cardboard box from the storage closet and packed everything neatly, methodically, like I was handling evidence instead of memories. I took photos of the contents, every shirt, every item, because something in my gut told me documentation was about to matter. I didn't text him. Instead, I reached out to his sister. She was the only family member whose number I hadn't blocked yet, mostly because she'd always been kind to me. His belongings are boxed and in my building's lobby. He has until 5:00 p.m. to pick them up. Her reply came quickly. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I had no idea this was happening. I'll make sure he gets them. That apology mattered more than I expected. It was the first acknowledgement that I wasn't crazy dramatic or overreacting. By noon, the group chat had transformed into something else entirely. What started as shock had shifted into investigation. People were pulling receipts like amateur detectives fueled by caffeine and righteous fury. Old photos, Instagram stories, timeline inconsistencies. Someone noticed that 3 months ago, he'd posted about a late work dinner, but another person zoomed into a mirror reflection and spotted his ex-girlfriend's car in the background. Another remembered him canceling a weekend trip with me because of family stuff that somehow coincided perfectly with her birthday. I didn't participate, I just watched. There was something surreal about seeing 53 people reconstruct the lies that had quietly dismantled my relationship while I was still inside it. It felt invasive and validating at the same time. His defenders tried to step in. One friend, someone I'd always thought of as neutral, typed, "Guys, this is getting really cruel. We don't know the full story." My cousin replied almost immediately, "We do. There's a 23-second audio file where he admits to cheating, manipulation, and lying. What part needs clarification?" After that, the defense fell apart quickly. Around mid-afternoon, his ex-girlfriend left the group chat without saying a word. No apology, no explanation, just gone. It felt symbolic, like the final act of a woman who'd been perfectly content being a ghost in my relationship. At 4:37 p.m., building security notified me that the box had been picked up. I didn't watch the footage until later. Friday night was quieter. Too quiet. The adrenaline wore off, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that made my limbs feel heavy. I cleaned my apartment not because it was dirty, but because movement felt safer than stillness. I threw away the spare toothbrush he'd left behind, donated the hoodie he'd forgotten on my couch months ago. Each item removed was a small reclaiming of space. Just when I started to believe the worst had passed, my phone rang. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hey, Sarah, this is Claire, his ex-girlfriend." Her voice was tight, rehearsed, like she'd practiced this call in the mirror. "I know this is awkward, but I wanted to talk to you." I closed my eyes. The truth was coming from somewhere else now, and I had the sinking feeling it was going to complicate everything. I stayed silent for a few seconds after she said her name, letting the weight of it hang there. "I don't think there's anything we need to talk about," I finally said, my voice steady in a way I didn't entirely feel. "I understand why you'd feel that way," Claire replied quickly, like she'd been bracing for impact. "But I really need you to hear this. Please." I leaned back against the kitchen counter, staring at the box of tea bags I hadn't touched all day. Part of me wanted to hang up. The other part, the one that had been piecing together lies for the past 24 hours, wanted answers. 5 minutes, I said. That's it. She exhaled audibly, relief bleeding into her voice. Thank you. What she said next didn't excuse anything, but it explained more than I expected. "He told me you two broke up months ago," she began, "that you were still living together because of the lease, that it was messy and complicated. He said you knew about me." I laughed. I couldn't help it. The sound came out sharp and humorless, like something breaking. "That's impressive," I said. "We went to my company holiday party together last month. I introduced him to my boss." There was a long pause on the line. "He told me you needed to keep up appearances for work," she said quietly. "Some office politics thing." "Creative," I muttered. Claire sounded genuinely shaken now. "Sarah, I swear I didn't know. If I had, you were still sleeping with someone you thought was in a relationship I cut in. Just not with me." She didn't argue that. "You're right." We compared notes then. Dates, weekends, late nights. Every time he'd claimed to be exhausted from work, he was exhausted from lying to two women with overlapping schedules. He'd painted himself as trapped in a loveless relationship to her and as a hardworking, loyal boyfriend to me. For 5 months. When we hung up, I felt strangely calm. Not relieved, just clear. The anger that had been scattered now had a single target. Saturday morning, his mother called. I didn't recognize the number, but curiosity won. "Is this Sarah?" she asked, her tone already accusatory. "Yes, this is Daniel's mother." I didn't bother correcting her. "He's not my boyfriend." A sharp inhale. About that. You need to stop this public humiliation immediately. You're destroying his reputation. I laughed again. Apparently that was my new reflex. He sent the voice note, I said. I responded. You changed your relationship status where everyone could see. I was single. This attitude she snapped is exactly why he looked elsewhere. You're cold. You have no emotional intelligence. That one landed. Not because it was true, but because it was so perfectly aligned with the narrative I could already see forming. Goodbye, I said, and blocked the number. By Saturday afternoon, the neutral crowd emerged, the ones who wanted peace at any cost. A mutual friend invited me for coffee, eyes full of concern. I know what he did was wrong, but don't you think the group chat thing got out of hand? He sent it there, I said. But changing your status like that in real time. Would you prefer I kept dating him? She didn't answer. Sunday was quieter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, that this wasn't ending, it was coiling. That night, a text came through from another unknown number. You need to publicly apologize for humiliating me. My lawyer says what you did is defamation. I forwarded it to a lawyer friend. He replied with a laughing emoji. Defamation requires false statements. Playing his own voice note isn't defamation. I typed back one sentence. Have your lawyer contact mine. Then I blocked the number. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. By Monday morning, the shock had worn off. What replaced it wasn't peace, it was vigilance. I started writing things down. Times, dates, phone numbers, screenshots saved to a folder I labeled with deliberate neutrality documentation. I told myself it was just to stay organized, but deep down I knew I was preparing for something I couldn't yet name. The first sign came at 9:17 a.m. My phone rang while I was at my desk halfway through an email. The caller ID read Building Management. My stomach tightened. Hi, this is Sarah Wright, I said, trying to keep my voice professional. Good morning, Ms. Wright, the manager replied. We've received a complaint about excessive noise coming from your unit over the weekend. There's also an allegation of harassment toward another resident. For a second, I couldn't speak. I live alone, I finally said. I haven't had anyone over, and I don't know what harassment you're referring to. We're required to investigate all complaints, she said carefully. Would you be available to come in later today? I walked into the management office that afternoon with my laptop, my phone, and a calm I had to manufacture consciously. I showed them my doorbell footage, Friday night through Sunday evening. No guests, no parties, no raised voices, just me, the occasional delivery driver, and silence after 10 p.m. The manager watched, then cleared her throat. The complaint was anonymous, she said. Given the evidence, we're dismissing it. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Anonymous. Of course it was. Tuesday escalated. At lunch, a coworker I trusted, someone who'd been in that group chat since college, pulled me aside into an empty conference room. He closed the door gently, like he was about to deliver bad news. Hey, he said. I wanted to give you a heads up before this blindsides you. Someone called HR this morning. My heart dropped. They claimed you'd been sending harassing messages. Said they felt unsafe with you working here. I sat down hard in the nearest chair. Did they provide any proof, I asked. No. They wouldn't identify themselves either. HR flagged it as suspicious and didn't take action, but yeah. I thanked him, went back to my desk and stared at my screen without seeing a single word. This wasn't embarrassment anymore. This was an attempt to damage my life. That afternoon, I hired a real lawyer, not a friend. Not a casual consultation, an employment and civil litigation attorney who listened quietly as I laid out the timeline. The voice note, the public breakup, the apartment complaint, the HR call, the defamation threat. When I finished, he leaned back and nodded once. This is harassment, he said, and it's escalating. He drafted a cease and desist letter that afternoon. It went out Wednesday morning, addressed to my ex-boyfriend by full legal name. It demanded an immediate end to false reports, third-party interference, and any further attempts to damage my reputation or livelihood. His response came faster than expected. His lawyer, yes, he'd actually hired one, sent back a letter claiming I was the harasser, that my actions had caused emotional distress, that I needed to remove defamatory content from my social media. My lawyer's reply was one paragraph long. What content? Changing my relationship status wasn't defamation. Repeating his own words wasn't harassment. Radio silence followed. I allowed myself to exhale for the first time in days. That peace lasted less than 24 hours. Thursday morning, as I was pouring coffee in the break room, security called my desk. Ms. Wright, there's a woman downstairs demanding to see you. She says it's a family emergency. My chest tightened. What's her name? They told me. His mother. Please escort her out, I said. I'm not receiving visitors. 20 minutes later, my boss stopped by my desk. Just so you know, he said gently, security had to threaten to call the police. She was very insistent. I explained everything in broad strokes. Messy breakup, harassment, legal involvement. He nodded slowly. Document everything he said. If this continues, we escalate. That night, I sat on my couch, surrounded by screenshots, call logs, and letters. I sent everything to my lawyer. His response came back short and precise. If this continues, we file for a restraining order. I stared at the message, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. I still thought naively that there were lines people wouldn't cross. I had no idea how wrong I was. Friday morning started quietly, which should have been my first warning. No calls, no emails, no anonymous numbers lighting up my screen. After weeks of escalation, the silence felt unnatural, like the moment right before something breaks. I tried to convince myself it meant the cease and desist had worked, that maybe finally he understood that this had gone too far. By noon, I knew better. It started with a text from a number I actually recognized, one of his closest friends, someone who'd left the group chat early on after defending him and quietly disappeared from my life. Hey, I don't know how else to say this, but you need to know what he's telling people. My stomach dropped. He's saying you hit him, that he had to get out because things were getting physical, that the voice note was him trying to escape. For a full 10 seconds, I couldn't move. My brain stalled like it was buffering a reality it refused to load. Of all the lies he could have told, cheating, incompatibility, misunderstanding, he chose the one that destroys people even when it's proven false. Abuse accusations don't need proof to do damage. They just need oxygen. I called my lawyer immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I had to put the phone on speaker and pace my apartment. This is serious, he said after I explained. His tone had changed, sharper, more urgent. Accusing someone of criminal conduct when it's false is defamation per se. It's one of the few categories where damages are presumed. People are going to believe him, I said, even if they don't say it out loud. That's why we act fast, he replied. Do you have proof he's saying this? I didn't yet, but I got it within the hour. I reached out to 5 mutual friends. Not emotionally, not defensively. Just one sentence, I've been told. Daniel is accusing me of physical abuse. Has he said this to you? 3 responded yes. 1 sent screenshots. I had to leave because she was getting physical. The voice note thing was me trying to protect myself. Seeing my name attached to that sentence made my vision blur. I felt nauseous, dizzy, like the floor was tilting beneath me. I had never laid a hand on him. Not once. Not in anger, not in argument, not ever. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was war. My lawyer drafted the lawsuit that night. Defamation per se, reputational harm, emotional distress, interference with employment. We filed first thing Monday morning. People don't talk enough about how exhausting it is to sue someone. It's not empowering. It's not cinematic. It's paperwork and reliving trauma and knowing your name is about to be attached to words you never wanted associated with you. But some lies can't be ignored. Being labeled an abuser is one of them. The effect was immediate. The moment he was officially served, everything stopped. No more anonymous complaints, no more HR calls, no messages from his mother. Silence, real silence this time. His lawyer contacted mine within 48 hours. He wanted to settle. When my lawyer told me I didn't feel relief, I felt tired, bone deep, soul level tired. But I also felt something else rising underneath it. Resolve, because this time I wasn't just defending myself. I was ending it. The first settlement offer came in like an insult wrapped in politeness. Drop the lawsuit. Mutual non-disparagement. Everyone walks away. No admission of wrongdoing. My lawyer didn't even look at me before he laughed. Absolutely not, he said, already typing. What they wanted was silence. What I needed was the truth on record. My counterterms were simple but non-negotiable. First, a written admission that he fabricated the abuse allegations. Second, a written retraction sent to every person he told the lie to. We already had the list. Third, a public apology acknowledging he lied about me being violent. Fourth, compensation for legal fees. Fifth, a no-contact order prohibiting him from contacting me, my workplace, my home, or my family. His lawyer pushed back hard. My client cannot admit to defamation. That exposes him legally. My lawyer cut him off mid-sentence. He already defamed her in writing. We have screenshots, 3 witnesses. If you want to go to trial, we'll happily let a judge read them. Negotiations dragged on for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of emails, calls, and carefully worded half apologies that tried to avoid responsibility without denying the lie outright. They claimed emotional distress, trauma, confusion. My lawyer dismantled each excuse with surgical precision. If he believed it was true, he said he wouldn't be retracting it. Eventually, they cracked. The final settlement wasn't perfect. It never is. He signed a written statement acknowledging that certain claims regarding physical conduct were inaccurate and are hereby retracted. Not the full-throated admission I wanted, but enough to clear my name legally. He sent that statement to the 8 people I could prove he'd lied to directly. He posted a brief apology on social media. I made statements about my ex-girlfriend that were not true. I take full responsibility and apologize for the harm caused. It stayed up for 24 hours per the agreement. Long enough to be screenshotted. Long enough to travel. I received $3,500 toward my legal fees. Not all of them, but enough that I didn't feel punished for defending myself. And most importantly, a 2-year no-contact order. If he reaches out to me, my employer, or my residents, it becomes criminal harassment. When it was over, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet. The group chat reaction was telling. Once word spread about the lawsuit and the false abuse claims, the remaining defenders went silent. Even his closest friends stopped engaging. One by one, people distanced themselves, not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly stepping back from someone who'd proven he would lie about anything to avoid consequences. A few days later, his ex-girlfriend messaged me. I saw the apology. I am glad you got some justice. For what it's worth, he tried the same thing with me. When I cut him off, told people I was obsessive and unstable. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. What mattered was that the story had finally stopped being rewritten. There was one part left, letting go. 6 weeks after the voice note, my life felt smaller. Not emptier, quieter. The constant tension that had lived in my shoulders finally eased. I slept through the night again. I stopped checking over my shoulder when my phone rang. The documentation folder on my laptop stayed untouched for days at a time, no longer growing. The group chat slowly returned to normal. Memes crept back in. Inside jokes resurfaced. The birthday barbecue everyone had been planning since before everything happened actually took place. I went. People didn't treat me like glass or avoid eye contact. No one asked invasive questions. Someone made a brief joke about voice notes and everyone laughed, then immediately moved on. That was healing in its own strange way. Therapy helped too. Naming the emotions I'd been sprinting past. Betrayal. Whiplash. The particular terror of having your character attacked with something you'd never done. My therapist said something that stuck with me. False accusations hurt, not just because they're lies, but because they threaten the version of yourself you know to be true. I wasn't dating. Not yet. Trust felt like a muscle I'd strained badly. It would heal, but only with time and care. I wasn't in a rush to prove anything to anyone. One night, my roommate asked me a question I'd been asked before. Do you ever regret how you handled it, the group chat? Changing your status publicly. I thought about it longer this time. If I'd handled it privately, he would have controlled the narrative. He already tried to rewrite reality when witnesses existed. Without them, I would have been alone with his version of events. And eventually, people would have believed him. No, I said, I don't regret it. He sent that voice note to 53 people. He mocked me. He said I'd never find out. The public nature of it made lying harder later. It forced accountability when he would have preferred secrecy. Some mistakes are accidents. Some are revelations. Here's what I learned. Some people will escalate endlessly rather than accept consequences. They'll lie, manipulate, play the victim. And when that stops working, they'll cross lines they swear they never would. The moment you refuse to be gaslit, the mask slips. He bet on my silence, on my embarrassment, on my willingness to smooth things over for the sake of comfort. He lost that bet. He thought no one was watching. 53 people were watching. And this time the truth stayed louder than the lie. Consider it dealt with. My name is Eleanor Galvin, and I am 51 years old. I've been divorced from my ex-husband, David Galvin, for 12 years. The marriage didn't end quietly. It ended the way most betrayals do, slowly, privately, and then all at once, when the truth becomes too heavy to ignore. David had a long-term affair with a woman named Vanessa Hale, a woman he eventually moved in with and later married. I lost more than a marriage in that divorce. I lost time, peace, and a frightening amount of my future income. Despite the infidelity, the court leaned heavily in his favor. I paid significant alimony for a decade. It finally ended last year. We have one daughter together, Isla, now 19. Child support ended when she turned 18, but that was only the legal minimum. Outside the court order, I paid for everything. I wanted her to have the best life possible, even if it meant I lived with less. I covered her full tuition at a prestigious private university tuition housing fees, nearly $70,000 a year. I bought her a new compact SUV, paid the insurance, paid for gas, transferred a generous monthly allowance directly to her debit card, kept her phone on my family plan, and created a revocable trust fund, seeded with a large portion of my own investment set to transfer to her when she turned 25. I am a software consultant. I earn well, but this level of support meant I kept accepting high-stress contracts I would have otherwise declined. I did it because she was my daughter. David and Vanessa, meanwhile, lived a bohemian lifestyle. David dabbled in freelance work. Vanessa sold handmade ceramics online. They were the fun parents. I was the one who paid for everything. I accepted that arrangement for years, even as Isla slowly drifted away from me. Last Friday, she came home for a rare weekend visit. Usually she's too busy, too many plans, too many friends. When she walked into my house, she didn't hug me. She barely looked at me, earbuds and shoulders tense, already halfway gone. I asked how classes were going. She shrugged and said, "Fine." I mentioned I'd been reviewing my project schedule for the upcoming quarter. Nothing accusatory, nothing sharp, just conversation. She yanked out her earbuds like I'd insulted her. "Can you not?" she snapped. "I literally just got here. I just need to pick up my allowance. Can we get this over with?" That familiar cold prickle ran through me, the one I'd learned to ignore. I told her I was just trying to talk, that I was her mother. She laughed, short, sharp, cruel. "My real mom is Vanessa," she said. "She actually listens to me. She's there. She helps me with my art projects. She talks to me about my life." She stepped closer, her face tight with a contempt that felt rehearsed. "You want to know what you are?" she asked. Her voice dripped with disdain. "You're a wallet. You're just a wallet to me. Not a mother. You're an ATM. And honestly, you're not even a very good one. You're always budgeting. Vanessa says if you really loved me, you wouldn't have to plan my allowance." I stared at her. 12 years of missed school events. 12 years of being excluded. 12 years of watching another woman use my money to play mother while I funded the illusion. And in that moment, something inside me shut off completely. The hurt didn't explode. It disappeared. In its place was clarity. Cold, precise, unmistakable. I smiled. Just a small, tight smile. "Understood," I said. I went to my desk, took the pre-written allowance check from the drawer, and handed it to her. My voice didn't shake. She snatched it without looking at me. "I'll see you at Christmas," she muttered. "I wouldn't count on it," I replied calmly. She rolled her eyes and left, slamming the door behind her. I sat there for 10 minutes after she was gone. Then I reached for my phone. The transaction was over. I didn't act out of anger. That's what surprised me most. When I finally stood up from my desk, there was no shaking in my hands, no heat in my chest, no urge to pace or rant or replay the conversation. There was only a quiet sense of completion, the way you feel after finally shutting down a machine that's been grinding itself to death for years. I poured myself a cup of coffee, let it sit untouched, and opened my laptop. I wasn't improvising. I wasn't reacting. I was executing a decision that had already been made the moment Isla told me exactly what role I played in her life. My first call was to my financial advisor, Martin Keller, a man who had warned me more than once that I was overextending myself emotionally and financially. "I need to dissolve the revocable trust I established for my daughter," I told him. There was a pause on the line, the kind that comes from someone choosing their words carefully. "The entire trust?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Liquidate the assets and transfer them back into my personal portfolio." He reminded me that the trust had been positioned as a future safety net. I reminded him that it was revocable for a reason. He didn't argue after that. He just asked if I was sure. I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my life. The next call was to the university's bursar's office. I introduced myself as the primary account holder for Isla Galvin and requested that the current payment plan for the upcoming semester be canceled immediately. The woman on the line sounded confused, then cautious. She explained the banks, the deadlines, the consequences. I listened patiently and then told her calmly that all future tuition bills were to be redirected to Isla herself. She would now be financially responsible for her education. I asked for written confirmation. When it arrived in my inbox minutes later, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt relief. I logged into the 529 college savings account next. I had opened it when Isla was 5 years old, long before the divorce, long before I knew how expensive loyalty could be. The balance was significant. 6 figures. I requested a full, non-qualified withdrawal. The automated warning about penalties and taxes flashed across the screen, bright and insistent. I checked the box, acknowledging them without hesitation. The money had been earmarked for education, and it would still be used for that purpose, just not hers. I called my attorney, Janet Holloway, and told her I'd initiated several large financial changes regarding my adult daughter. I didn't need advice yet, I said, but I wanted her on retainer. I suspected my ex-husband would react badly. Janet didn't sound surprised. She simply told me to document everything and forward any communication directly to her. I promised I would. Then came the smaller switches, the ones that had kept Isla's life frictionless for years. I logged into my phone carrier account and removed her line from my family plan. Her phone would stop working by midnight. I logged into my insurance portal and removed her from my auto policy. The car itself was in her name, a mistake I'd made years earlier, thinking ownership would teach her responsibility. Driving uninsured would be her problem now, not mine. When the 529 withdrawal cleared a few days later, minus the brutal tax hit, I made a single irrevocable donation to a foundation that provides scholarships and grants to orphans and foster children. I spoke directly to the director and requested that the grant be named in honor of my parents, both long gone, both of whom had taught me that generosity meant nothing if it was forced. She cried when I told her the amount. I hung up feeling lighter than I had in years. I transferred what had once been Isla's monthly allowance into my retirement account. Then I finally drank the coffee I'd poured earlier, now cold and bitter, sitting on my patio as the sun dipped low. For the first time in 12 years, I didn't feel like a wallet. I didn't feel like a mother begging for relevance. I just felt quiet. I knew the silence wouldn't last. I also knew I was ready for whatever came next. It took 9 days. I remember the number because I was surprised it took that long. I had expected the phone to start ringing within hours, maybe even minutes, but silence stretched on unbroken and almost eerie. Part of me assumed Isla hadn't noticed yet, or that she believed some temporary glitch would resolve itself if she waited long enough. She had always lived in a world where problems quietly disappeared once someone else paid for them. The first call didn't come from her. Of course it didn't. It came from David. I was in the middle of a code review when his name flashed across my screen. I stared at it for a moment, feeling nothing, and let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message later, I almost laughed. His voice was sharp, frantic, laced with the kind of outrage that only comes from entitlement being challenged. He demanded to know what I had done. Isla was hysterical, he said. The university had deregistered her from all her spring classes. Her account was frozen. This had to be a mistake. I needed to fix it immediately. I didn't call him back. I saved the voicemail and sent a single text. All communication must go through my lawyer, Janet Holloway. Here is her number. 2 hours later, Janet's office called me. She sounded almost amused. David's attorney had accused me of parental financial abandonment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He demanded I reinstate tuition, reopen the trust, and provide a larger allowance to compensate for the trauma. Janet told him calmly that all financial support beyond child support and alimony had been voluntary, and both obligations were long since fulfilled. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that the funds formerly designated for Isla's education had already been donated to an irrevocable scholarship fund. According to Janet, there was a long silence on the other end of the line before he asked. She already gave it away. That evening, the escalation took a darker turn. 2 police officers knocked on my door. My heart jumped, despite myself, old instincts flaring. The older officer asked if I was Eleanor Galvin and explained they'd received a welfare call from my ex-husband. He was concerned I'd been acting erratically, liquidating assets, and might be a danger to myself. I nearly laughed at the audacity, but I kept my face neutral. I told them the truth that I'd stopped paying my 19-year-old daughter's private university tuition and made a large charitable donation instead. I showed them the receipt from the foundation. The younger officer's eyes widened. The older one sighed, already recognizing the situation for what it was. A domestic financial dispute dressed up as concern. After they left, my phone lit up. Isla had clearly gotten a prepaid phone. The messages came in waves: rage first, then blame, then desperation. She called me a monster. She said I was ruining her life over one comment. She blamed Vanessa. She blamed David. Then the tone shifted. Apologies, promises, declarations of love that felt copied from a script. She begged me to turn the money back on, said she couldn't go to community college, that all her friends were where she was now. I read every message without responding, waiting to feel something. I didn't. When I finally replied, it was with the same line I'd sent her father. All communication must go through my lawyer. Then I blocked the number. The silence that followed felt earned. The emergency hearing was scheduled faster than I expected, less than 2 weeks after David's voicemail and the failed welfare check. I found myself sitting in a courtroom that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, listening to the shuffle of restless feet and murmured conversations. David arrived with Vanessa at his side, her hand resting protectively on Isla's shoulder as if she were the wronged party in all of this. Isla looked smaller than I remembered, her eyes red, her posture folded inward, the picture of carefully coached distress. When she saw me, her expression hardened into something sharper, more resentful. Their attorney spoke first. He painted a portrait of cruelty and abandonment, arguing that I had established a long-standing pattern of financial support that amounted to an implied contract. By cutting it off so suddenly, he claimed I was acting maliciously and punitively punishing my daughter for an emotional outburst. Isla dabbed at her eyes on cue, her sobs quiet but conspicuous. The performance might have moved someone unfamiliar with the facts. I watched without reacting, hands folded, breathing steady. Then Janet stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply laid out the truth with surgical precision. She presented bank statements documenting years of tuition payments, allowances, insurance premiums, and living expenses that went far beyond any legal obligation. She submitted the police report from the fraudulent welfare check, noting the judge's tightening jaw as he read it. She presented copies of Isla's messages, the ones calling me a wallet, the ones begging me to turn the money back on. Finally, she submitted proof of the completed, irrevocable donation to the Orphan Scholarship Fund. Your Honor, Janet said the money is gone. It is educating children who have no parent to turn to, no wallet to demand from. My client's decision to redirect her generosity is not a crime. It is a choice. The judge looked directly at Isla. Did you tell your mother she was nothing but a wallet to you? He asked. Isla stammered, her eyes darting to Vanessa, then David. She said she'd been upset that she hadn't meant it. The judge shook his head, unimpressed. He dismissed their motion with prejudice, warning their attorney about filing frivolous claims and explicitly condemning the misuse of a welfare check as a litigation tactic. As we filed out, Isla wasn't crying anymore. She stared at me with something close to hatred. I didn't look back. The call came a week later from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but I was waiting on a contractor, so I answered. It was David. His tone was different this time. Softer. Uncertain, the way people sound when they realize they've lost leverage. He said things had gotten out of hand, that everyone had said things they didn't mean, that Isla was struggling. She'd withdrawn from the university and enrolled in the local community college for the fall. It wasn't free, he added quickly. She needed a car insurance, a phone. He was calling, he said, mother to mother, hoping I might help with the small things again. I listened without interrupting, feeling a strange detachment settle over me. When he finished, I told him the car was in Isla's name. She could sell it. That would cover a year of community college. As for the allowance, I suggested she look for a part-time job. That's what responsibility looked like. David started to protest. I cut him off gently. I'm no longer in business, as I said. You wanted to be the real parent. Congratulations. The wallet is closed. I hung up before he could respond. Through my former sister-in-law, the only person on that side who ever treated me with respect, I heard how badly things had unraveled. Isla was furious about having to work 20 hours a week. The bohemian loft wasn't so charming when it was crowded with resentment and unpaid bills. She blamed David and Vanessa for not being able to sustain the life she'd been promised. She blamed me for refusing to rescue her from it. I left a week later. 3 months of travel places I'd only ever seen through hotel windows between deadlines. My phone stayed quiet. My bank account was finally mine. The thank you letter from the first recipient of my parents' scholarship grant sits framed on my desk now. I thought I'd lost my place as a mother. It turns out I was wrong. I just wasn't meant to be one to someone who only knew how to count what I gave. My name is Edith Green, and I am 32 years old. Until recently, I believed I was standing on the edge of a life I had carefully built with the man I planned to marry. We had been together for 4 years, engaged since last September, with a wedding date set for June. On paper, everything looked solid: shared routines, mutual friends, a future that seemed decided. But beneath that surface, something had begun to erode quietly, the way water wears away stone, long before the cracks are visible. About 2 months before everything unraveled, Paul started to feel distant in ways that were subtle enough to excuse, but persistent enough to unsettle me. His phone was always face down. He started working late, even though his job had never demanded it before. Conversations that once flowed easily turned clipped and functional. When I reached for him in bed, he sighed, not angrily, but with the weary impatience of someone who felt interrupted. I didn't think he was cheating. I told myself that relationships go through phases, that stress can make people withdraw, that love sometimes requires patience instead of panic. I wanted to believe that what we were experiencing was temporary and fixable. That was why I suggested couples therapy, not as an accusation and not because I thought our relationship was broken beyond repair, but because communication had started to feel strained and brittle. I believed that bringing in a professional might help us reset before resentment hardened into something permanent. Paul agreed, though his agreement felt hollow, like something he offered to avoid a longer conversation rather than because he believed in it. We found a therapist with availability on Thursday evenings. The sessions were expensive, $175 each, and since I earned more, I paid without hesitation. I treated it as an investment in our future, something worth protecting. The first session was easy enough, mostly introductions and surface-level discussions about how we met and what we loved about each other. The second session went deeper, and that was when the therapist gently noted how Paul tended to deflect when asked directly about his feelings. He joked, generalized, and redirected, never quite answering the question he'd been asked. I noticed it too, but I still wanted to believe it didn't mean what it felt like it meant. The third session was scheduled for 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and I arrived early. I left work ahead of schedule, grabbed a coffee, and sat in the waiting room at 5:50, scrolling on my phone and rehearsing what I wanted to say. At exactly 6 o'clock, Paul wasn't there. I texted him to check in, asking if he was on his way. 5 minutes later, he replied that he was running a little late and told me to start without him. It felt odd, but not alarming enough to make a scene. The therapist called me in, and I explained that Paul would be joining us shortly. She nodded and suggested we begin with some individual reflection while we waited. By 6:15, he still hadn't arrived. I texted again asking if everything was okay. His response came quickly, and when I read it, my stomach tightened. In a way I couldn't immediately explain. He said he was grabbing drinks with an old friend and had lost track of time, but that he would be there soon. I stared at my phone, read the message again, and then handed it to the therapist without saying anything at first. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded steadier than I felt. I told her that he was getting drinks during our scheduled therapy session, one that he had known about for 2 weeks. The therapist maintained her composure, but I could see the calculation behind her neutral expression. She asked how that made me feel, and the answer came out more honestly than I expected. I told her it made me feel like I wasn't a priority, and as soon as I said it, something inside me clicked into place. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern I had been smoothing over for months. The canceled dinner plans because someone else needed him more. The birthday party he showed up late to without apology. The vacation discussions he kept postponing while still finding time for spontaneous outings with other people. For the next 45 minutes, the therapist and I talked about patterns, boundaries, and what I wanted from a partnership versus what I was actually receiving. She called it a productive individual session, but to me, it felt like a quiet reckoning. At 6:58, 2 minutes before the session was scheduled to end, the door opened. Paul walked in looking flushed, smelling faintly of wine and wearing an expression of casual confusion as if he'd wandered into the wrong room. He apologized lightly and asked if he had missed much. I looked at him and told him the session was over. He laughed and pointed out that it didn't end until 7, brushing it off as if time were flexible when it came to things that mattered to me. When he called it not a big deal, something settled uncomfortably in my chest, heavy and unmistakable. It wasn't that he was late. It was that he didn't care that he was late. And in that moment, sitting in that quiet office with a therapist who had just watched everything I'd been excusing laid bare, I realized that the empty chair at the start of the session hadn't been the real problem. The problem was that emotionally, that chair had been empty for a long time. We left the therapist's office separately, which hadn't been the plan but suddenly felt inevitable. Paul said he needed to grab his car from a different lot, a small logistical excuse that mirrored so many others he had used lately, and I didn't argue. The silence between us in the hallway felt heavier than any confrontation could have. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking not from anger, but from the slow, dawning realization that something I had been trying to save might already be beyond repair. I drove home replaying the session in my head, not his lateness, but the way the therapist had listened, the way she hadn't rushed to soothe or justify, the way she had let the truth sit in the room without softening it. When Paul arrived later that evening, he acted as if nothing significant had happened. He kicked off his shoes, asked if I was hungry, and commented on traffic with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. The normalcy felt surreal, like watching someone continue a performance after the audience had already left. I responded politely, but minimally, giving him nothing to push against. I could see the irritation building behind his eyes, the discomfort of not being reassured that everything was fine. Around 10 o'clock, he finally snapped and asked if I was seriously still upset about him being late, framing it as a single minor misstep that I was dragging out unnecessarily. That was the moment I said it out loud. The sentence that had been forming since I sat alone in the waiting room earlier that evening. I told him I was reconsidering the engagement. The words didn't come with drama or raised voices. They landed flat and heavy between us. Paul stared at me as if I'd spoken in another language, then demanded to know how I could even think about throwing away 4 years over something so small. I tried to explain that it wasn't one incident, that it was a pattern of choices that consistently placed me last. But he heard accusation where I was offering clarity. He called me controlling, said I was looking for problems where none existed, and accused me of blowing things out of proportion because a stranger in a therapist's office had gotten into my head. I didn't argue back the way I might have months earlier. Instead, I told him I needed time to think time without being pressured, to minimize my own feelings for the sake of keeping the peace. That night, I slept in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and wondering how long I had been slowly adjusting myself to fit into the space he was willing to give me. In the morning, he left for work without saying goodbye, a quiet confirmation of how easily avoidance had become his default response. I spent the day in a fog, going through the practical realities of our shared life with an unexpected sense of calm. We didn't share bank accounts, something I had once considered a lack of commitment, but now felt grateful for. The apartment lease was in my name, signed before he moved in. The engagement ring had been my grandmother's, passed down, with the expectation that it would return to the family if things didn't work out. Each fact grounded me further, stripping away the panic and replacing it with something steadier, something closer to resolve. By the time Paul texted that evening, asking if we could talk, I knew the conversation wouldn't be about convincing me to stay so much as about whether he was willing to finally tell the truth. When he came home, he brought takeout from my favorite Thai place, a peace offering that felt rehearsed. He launched into an apology that sounded practiced, admitting he'd been uncomfortable with therapy because it made the relationship feel broken and confessing that avoiding the session had seemed easier than facing our problems. I listened without interrupting, waiting for the part where honesty went deeper than explanation. When I asked who the friend was, the air in the room changed immediately. Paul blinked, stalled, and then deflected, asking why it mattered and accusing me of interrogating him instead of accepting his apology. I repeated the question calmly, explaining that he had chosen this person over our therapy session and that I deserved to know who that was. His refusal to answer told me more than any name could have. The defensiveness, the shifting focus, the insistence that I was being unreasonable, all followed the same familiar script, and for the first time I didn't play my part in it. I stood up and told him I thought we should take a break. The word hit him harder than I expected, and he reacted with disbelief, then anger, then tears that felt more like frustration than remorse. He left in a rush, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall, and texted minutes later to say he was staying with his sister. I didn't respond. That night, I sat on the couch making quiet lists in my head, separating what was mine from what was his, and realizing that clarity, once it arrives, is impossible to unsee. The apartment was unnervingly quiet the next morning, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel amplified. I went through my routine on autopilot, making coffee, checking emails, getting dressed for work, all while my mind circled the same unanswered question. It wasn't about jealousy or suspicion in the way Paul wanted to frame it. It was about honesty. Someone who had nothing to hide wouldn't treat a name like a state secret. That thought followed me throughout the day, settling deeper with every hour that passed without a message from him. When Paul finally reached out, it wasn't with an explanation, but with a request. He asked if we could talk that evening face to face, and I agreed more out of a desire for closure than hope. I didn't want to spend another night filling in the blanks on my own. When he arrived, he looked tired, not devastated, but worn down in the way someone gets when they're forced to defend a version of events that doesn't quite hold together. He took a deep breath and launched into what was clearly a prepared speech, admitting again that skipping therapy had been a mistake, and insisting that it had nothing to do with caring less about me. He told me he loved me, that he wanted to marry me, and that he was asking for another chance. I listened carefully, waiting for the moment where accountability replaced performance. When I asked again who he had been drinking with, his composure cracked. He stalled, asked why I was fixating on something so unimportant, and accused me of turning an apology into an interrogation. I told him calmly that the question mattered because he had lied about where he was, and because he had chosen that person over our commitment to therapy. The refusal that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and firm, which somehow made it worse. He said the name wasn't relevant, and that what mattered was that he was there now, trying to fix things. That answer shifted something in me permanently. It told me that even now, even after everything that had happened, he was still more invested in controlling the narrative than in telling the truth. I told him I needed space to decide what I wanted, not because he was late once, but because he couldn't give me a straight answer about something that directly affected my trust in him. He reacted with disbelief, then anger, framing my need for space as an overreaction fueled by paranoia. He accused me of throwing away 4 years over someone from his past, even as he continued to insist that person didn't matter enough to name. When he left, slamming the door behind him, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. The chaos he brought with him seemed to exit the room at the same time, leaving behind a clarity that felt both painful and grounding. Over the next 2 days, the silence stretched on, broken only by practical thoughts that began to organize themselves without effort. I mentally cataloged our belongings, noting which pieces of furniture I had owned before he moved in, and which things we had bought together. The process wasn't about punishment or control. It was about preparing myself for the possibility that this really was the end. On Sunday afternoon, Paul's sister showed up unannounced. I had always gotten along with her well enough, but that day she didn't bother with pleasantries. She demanded to know what was wrong with me, accusing me of devastating her brother over a single mistake. I listened quietly and then asked her what he had told her that mistake was. When she said he'd claimed he was simply late to therapy, I corrected her gently, explaining that he had skipped the session to get drinks with someone he refused to identify. The shift in her expression was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of doubt that told me she hadn't been given the full story. She left not long after, less confrontational than when she arrived, and I knew I had planted a seed whether she wanted to acknowledge it or not. The following morning, Paul texted again, asking if he could come over that evening because he owed me an explanation. I agreed, not because I expected reconciliation, but because I needed to hear the truth from his own mouth. Whatever was coming, I was ready to face it, even if it confirmed what I already suspected. Paul arrived right on time that evening, which would have felt meaningful if punctuality hadn't already been stripped of its symbolism. He stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in as if he were bracing himself for impact, and I noticed immediately that he hadn't brought food flowers or any small offering to soften the conversation. This wasn't going to be an apology disguised as comfort. It was going to be a confession, or at least the closest version of one he was willing to give. He sat across from me and told me he owed me honesty. The phrasing struck me as careful, almost legalistic, and I waited without interrupting as he explained that the person he had gone for drinks with wasn't just an old friend, but a woman he had briefly dated in college. He was quick to minimize it, emphasizing that it had been only a few dates, and that it hadn't been serious, that they hadn't spoken in years, and that nothing had happened between them that night. As he spoke, I felt a strange detachment settle over me, as though I were watching the scene from outside my own body, listening not just to his words, but to what he was still avoiding. I repeated his explanation back to him slowly, letting the reality of it fill the room. He had skipped our therapy session to get drinks with someone he had once been involved with, then lied about who she was and where he was, and continued to withhold the truth even when confronted directly. When I said it that way, he flinched and told me I was framing it unfairly. That context mattered, that it sounded worse than it was. I asked him why, if it was so insignificant, he hadn't just told me the truth from the beginning. His answer was the same one I had heard in different forms for weeks. He knew I would overreact. That explanation landed like a quiet insult. It wasn't just that he had lied, it was that he believed I couldn't be trusted with the truth, that managing my reaction mattered more than respecting my right to make informed choices about my own relationship. We went in circles for over an hour, him apologizing for the outcome while defending the decision that caused it, me trying to explain that accountability meant more than regret after the fact. At some point, I realized that the conversation wasn't moving toward resolution, only repetition. That was when I asked for the engagement ring back. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. He stared at me in disbelief, then accused me of being cold, of punishing him instead of working through the issue like adults. I reminded him that the ring had belonged to my grandmother, that it wasn't just a symbol of our future, but of my family's trust, and that trust had been damaged. He didn't argue with that, at least not directly. Instead, he stood up, said he needed time to think, and walked out wearing the ring, as if delaying the inevitable might somehow change its meaning. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet apartment and felt the weight of what I had just done settle in fully. I wasn't angry anymore. I was sad, deeply and achingly sad. But beneath that sadness was a sense of relief I hadn't expected. For the first time since things started to go wrong, I wasn't making excuses for him or softening the truth for my own comfort. I was simply acknowledging what was in front of me, even if it hurt. The next morning, my phone was full of missed calls and messages from people who weren't him. His mother left a voicemail accusing me of destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding. A mutual friend texted to ask if I was really willing to throw everything away over one mistake. I deleted the voicemail and didn't respond to the messages. I knew now that this wasn't about a single choice, but about a pattern of behavior that had finally been dragged into the light. I went to bed that night knowing the ring was still with him, but also knowing that whatever happened next, the engagement as I had understood it was already over. 10 days passed without a word from Paul, a silence so complete it felt deliberate. No texts, no calls, no late-night apologies, typed and deleted. At first I told myself he was thinking, processing, maybe even taking responsibility in his own way. But as the days stretched on, it became clear that the silence itself was a choice. I went to work, came home, and settled into a version of life that felt unfamiliar, but strangely steadier, as if my nervous system were finally getting a break from constant vigilance. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes and started noticing how peaceful the apartment felt when I wasn't waiting for the next explanation that never quite explained anything. That illusion shattered on a Thursday evening when I pulled into the parking lot and saw Paul's car parked in his old spot. For a moment, I just sat there with the engine running, staring through the windshield as if the car might disappear if I didn't acknowledge it. He still had a key, something I had meant to address, but hadn't found the emotional energy for yet. By the time I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my guard was already up, every instinct alert. Paul was sitting on the couch, and he wasn't alone. There was a woman beside him. Someone I had never seen before, perched stiffly at the edge of the cushion, like she was ready to stand at any moment. Paul jumped to his feet when he saw me. His movements rushed and uncoordinated, and introduced her with a confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. He said she was there to clear things up, to explain, to prove that nothing inappropriate had happened. Before I could respond, the woman stood as well and spoke, her voice careful and rehearsed, telling me she was the person he had gotten drinks with, and that she wanted me to know it had been innocent. The audacity of the scene almost made me laugh. They had decided, without my consent or warning, to stage an ambush in my own apartment, as if presenting a witness would somehow override weeks of lies and deflection. As she spoke, she insisted that nothing physical had happened, that they had only talked about old times, that she hadn't even known he was engaged until he mentioned it casually at the bar. That was when I noticed her eyes flick toward his hand, or rather to where the ring should have been. He wasn't wearing it. When I pointed that out, he muttered something about his fingers swelling. Sometimes a weak explanation that collapsed under its own weight the moment it was spoken. I asked the question that had been echoing in my mind since the therapy session, asking why. If everything had been so innocent, he had lied about who she was and where he was. He repeated the familiar line, saying he knew I would overreact, that he was trying to avoid drama, that bringing her here was meant to show transparency. Transparency, I told him, doesn't arrive unannounced with an audience. Transparency starts with the truth offered freely, not dragged out under pressure. The woman shifted uncomfortably and eventually excused herself, clearly realizing she had stepped into something far messier than she had been led to believe. After she left, Paul turned on me with a mix of frustration and wounded pride, accusing me of refusing to accept proof of making it impossible for him to do anything right. I reminded him that the problem wasn't that he had gotten drinks with someone from his past, but that he had lied about it repeatedly and then tried to control the fallout instead of owning it. That was when he reached for the ring. He yanked it off his finger and threw it at me hard enough that I barely had time to react before instinct kicked in and I caught it midair. The weight of it in my palm felt heavier than it ever had when I wore it less like jewelry and more like a final punctuation mark. He told me we were done, that he couldn't be with someone who didn't trust him, and I told him calmly and without raising my voice that I couldn't be with someone who believed trust meant accepting lies. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook, and I stood there alone in the aftermath ring, clenched in my hand, heart racing, but mind strangely clear. That night, I changed the locks, boxed up the rest of his belongings, and set them aside to be picked up by his sister. When the apartment finally went quiet again, it felt different this time, not hollow, but settled like a storm that had finally passed. The days after Paul left unfolded with an efficiency that surprised me. I changed the locks first, not out of spite, but out of necessity, because boundaries mean nothing if they aren't enforced. I boxed up what remained of his things and coordinated a brief, emotionless handoff through his sister, who showed up quieter than before, her earlier certainty replaced by something closer to resignation. I didn't ask what she now believed, and she didn't offer it. When she left, the apartment felt fully mine again, for the first time in months, not just legally, but emotionally, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. The fallout came in waves. Paul's mother called and left a voicemail so sharp it felt rehearsed, accusing me of destroying her son's life over a misunderstanding and warning me that I would regret being so unforgiving. I deleted it without listening twice. A mutual friend texted then, another each message carrying some version of the same question was, "I really willing to end an engagement over drinks with an ex-girlfriend?" I stopped replying altogether once I realized how easily the narrative shifted when details were selectively removed. Explaining myself felt pointless when the people asking weren't actually listening. What I didn't expect was the call from the therapist. She said she didn't usually reach out outside of scheduled sessions, but given how abruptly things had ended, she wanted to check in. I gave her the short version, leaving out the theatrics and focusing on the pattern that had finally become impossible to ignore. She listened and then said something that settled into me slowly, like a truth that had been waiting for permission to land. She told me the session had been productive because I had been ready to see what was already there, and that many people never reach that point. She offered a few individual sessions if I wanted them not to fix something broken, but to understand why I had stayed as long as I did. I agreed, realizing that clarity doesn't end with leaving. Sometimes it only begins there. In the sessions that followed, we talked about my own patterns, not just Paul's, why I had interpreted inconsistency as stress, why I had treated my time as flexible while guarding everyone else's, why I had mistaken endurance for loyalty. It wasn't comfortable work, but it was honest, and honesty. I was learning feels different when it isn't weaponized against you. I started sleeping better. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. The anxiety that had once lived just beneath my skin began to loosen its grip. I heard through mutual friends that Paul had started telling people I was controlling emotionally cold, that I had overreacted and refused to hear his side. The story was predictable, and oddly enough, it didn't hurt the way I thought it would. The people who knew me well didn't buy it, and the ones who did were never really in my corner to begin with. His sister sent one final text apologizing for showing up unannounced weeks earlier and admitting that when she pressed him about the pattern I described, he became defensive instead of reflective. I didn't respond, but I appreciated the acknowledgement. The ring went back to my family where it belonged. My mother admitted carefully and without judgment that she had worried about Paul for a long time but hadn't wanted to interfere. She told me I had always been explaining him away, and hearing it framed that way felt like someone turning on a light in a room I had been navigating in the dark. I donated what reminded me of him, kept what was practical, and rearranged the furniture so the apartment no longer looked like a shared life paused mid-scene. I'm not dating. I'm not rushing to replace what I lost because what I lost wasn't stability or safety, but the illusion of it. What I gained was something quieter and far more durable, the certainty that wanting honesty, consistency, and effort isn't asking for too much. It's asking for the bare minimum. The night everything fell apart, I sat alone in a therapist's office and admitted a truth I had been avoiding for months. The relationship had already ended. Paul just hadn't bothered to say it out loud. His absence that evening wasn't the end. It was the symptom. Now, when I sit on my couch in the evenings, the silence doesn't feel like loss. It feels like space. And space, I've learned, is where clarity finally has room to breathe. 3 weeks passed without anything dramatic happening, and for the first time since all of this began, that felt like a gift instead of a threat. No surprise visits, no emotional texts disguised as closure, no new versions of the story delivered through other people. The apartment settled into a rhythm that was entirely mine. I deep cleaned every room, not in a frantic erase the past kind of way, but methodically opening windows, donating what no longer felt like it belonged to my life, and keeping what was practical without attaching meaning to it. The couch stayed because replacing it would have been expensive, not because it held memories worth preserving, and that distinction mattered more than I expected. Work kept me busy, which helped. Routine has a way of anchoring you when your personal life feels like it's been rearranged overnight. Friends checked in. Some cautiously, others with relief, admitting they'd sensed something was off for a while, but hadn't known how to say it. I appreciated the honesty, even when it stung a little, because it confirmed what therapy had already started to uncover. I hadn't been imagining things. I had been adapting to them. The individual sessions with the therapist continued, and they were different from anything I'd expected. We didn't spend much time dissecting Paul's behavior anymore. Instead, we focused on why I stayed, why I rationalized inconsistency, why I treated discomfort as something to push through instead of information to listen to. She pointed out gently but firmly that I had been negotiating for basic consideration in a relationship that required me to keep lowering the bar to avoid conflict. Naming that didn't make me feel foolish. It made me feel awake. I did hear more about the narrative Paul was spreading, how I had supposedly blindsided him, how I was emotionally rigid and controlling, how therapy had turned me against him. A few people believed it, at least at first, but most didn't. The ones who knew me understood that I don't make impulsive decisions lightly, and that I had given more chances than I should have. The gossip lost its power quickly once I stopped trying to counter it. Silence, I learned, can be a boundary too. One afternoon, I received a final message from Paul's sister. She said she had talked to him again, asked about the pattern I'd described, and watched him deflect instead of reflect. She apologized for how she had confronted me weeks earlier and said I hadn't deserved any of it. I didn't respond, but I let the message sit there without resentment. Not everything needs a reply to be acknowledged. The ring remained with my family safe and unspoken. My mother admitted quietly that she had always felt something was off, that she had watched me make excuses, and hoped I would see things clearly on my own. Hearing that didn't make me angry. It made me feel supported in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Sometimes the people closest to you wait, not because they don't care, but because they trust you to arrive at the truth in your own time. I'm not ready to date, and I'm not in a hurry to be. For 4 years, I adjusted myself around someone else's absence, convincing myself that patience was the same thing as love. Now the absence is gone, and what remains is space quiet and a sense of relief that still surprises me when I notice it. I no longer feel like an option in my own life. I feel present. The Thursday evening, when everything unraveled, wasn't the end of my relationship. It was the moment I finally stopped pretending it hadn't already ended. Paul skipping therapy wasn't the betrayal that broke us. It was the clearest symptom of a pattern that had been unfolding slowly and visibly every time he chose something else over showing up for us. I'm grateful I saw it when I did, even if it took an empty chair and a solo therapy session to force my hand. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. When you consistently feel like an afterthought in a relationship, that feeling is telling you the truth. And listening to it isn't selfish, it's survival.